Hello and welcome to this fifth edition of the Knowledge Clips on Heringa, which this time is taped in Italy. I did buy a selfie stick to do this, which immediately broke down, so we're down to the old system. I'm taping this in the Salone dei Cinquecento of the Palazzo Vecchio because it very much symbolizes the kind of political struggle that we're talking about this week. If you remember our triangle of the three types of power which are always in a permanent struggle for balance. This week we're looking at the executive, we're looking at the government and the government's relationship with parliament in particular. And this Salone dei Cinquecento was formed in the beginning of the 16th century, after 1498, after the Medici government had been ousted by the Savonarola government in Italy to really form the start of the Republic and to symbolize the power of the people. This was where 500 people would sit and hold the government to power. And it's here that we talk about these divisions. Now, as always, in looking at the division of powers here and the way this is constitutionally recognized, it's important to make a number of distinctions. The first is, again, the difference between a presidential system and a parliamentary system. In a presidential system, the president gets his or her power directly from the people, and in that sense has a very different position of power. The distinguishing feature of a parliamentary system is that the power of the president or whoever holds a similar office, the power of the head of government, depends on the parliament. So the person in office is accountable to parliament. So this is a key distinction, presidential versus parliamentary systems in looking at governance and heads of state. Now, another very important distinction is that between heads of state and heads of government. Heads of state are typically the people invested with more ceremonial power, the people who would represent the country in external relationships. They would be the called president or the monarch in monarchical systems. And then you have the head of government, which is more works more on the day-to-day business of the government, and which would be the prime minister as, for instance, a primus inter pares, or more in the cabinet. In Italy, for instance, you have a president, which is Sergio Mattarella, and then you have a prime minister, which is Giuseppe Conte, and both hold very different offices. Now, the big questions this week are about how is a cabinet put in place, how is it controlled, and how and to what extent can Parliament use a cabinet and individual ministers. So very much about the relationship between Parliament and government. Let's look a bit at this putting into place of a cabinet in parliamentary systems first. A cabinet is, again, dependent on the power of parliament, but the actual putting in place, the actual investment of the power in a cabinet is regulated differently in different countries. In monarchies, for instance, you see that this process of investiture, the investiture of public power, is actually done by the monarch. So it's the monarch who invests the cabinet with public power. In other systems which really hold the political will of the public, the popular will at the core of their system. It is the parliament itself which also officially puts in place the cabinet. So that's a key distinction about the putting in place of a cabinet. Now, once a cabinet or a government, as Heringa calls it in the book, is in place, Parliament generally has all these mechanisms of control. It can ask questions to the government. It can put in place investigations of all kinds of sorts. And it also generally would have the power of censure, because it's this power of censure by which Parliament can ultimately exercise control over the government. Now, in the countries we look at, these powers of censure are organized very differently. At times, they can be exerted over both individuals, ministers, and the cabinet as a whole. And in other cases, the vote of no confidence only is held against, for instance, the head of government, as in Germany, after which the whole cabinet falls. So the ways in which Parliament can have a motion of censure, a vote of no confidence vis-à-vis the government differs, but this is a key instrument in every parliamentary system. Obviously not in presidential systems, because there the president has a separate political mandate. In the meantime, we're getting some nice background music here in the Sala Cinquecento. My own personal memory of this hall, as an anecdote, is the State of the Union I attended here in 2017, held by Jean-Claude Juncker. In this room, Juncker was speaking, I think it was May 2017, just after the Brexit vote. And an interesting thing was that he addressed all of us in French instead of in English. And he said, well, you know, English is kind of passé these days. We have to start talking German and French again in the European Union, thus also really putting Theresa May in place. So this happened here in the Sala Cinquecento, and also says something about the way in which the EU is organized. Jean-Claude Juncker, as you know, is the president of the European Commission. And the European Commission is the governing body, if you wish, of the European Union, but is of course not directly controlled by a parliament in the way that happens in EU nation states. And this is very much called the democratic deficit, something to take into account in also thinking about this multi-layered division of powers, that the EU and the European Commission can make laws which bind national parliaments but are not controlled as directly as national governments would be. So this is about the way in which parliaments control governments. Of course, there's a big question: what happens when, for instance, either heads of state or heads of government do not perform their functions well, possibly even engage in crimes? To what extent can they then be put out of office? Well, generally with heads of state, this is really difficult. Think about the monarchs in Europe, where the heads of government and the cabinets often carry ministerial responsibility for what the head of state does. In other cases, the head of government can be held, for instance, criminally accountable, and these procedures are typically set out in each and every constitution. For instance, also the procedures for the impeachment of a president like in the United States. In the United States, the president is both the head of state and the head of government, and for that reason, there's a special impeachment procedure that has to be followed if the president is accused of having committed certain crimes. So in studying the rules in place by which a government is put in place, by which a government is controlled by Parliament, and by which individual ministers can be held accountable, by which the collective can be held accountable, what happens in cases of crime, you can learn a lot about this triangle and the relation between governments and parliaments. That government will always try to find ways also to strengthen its position through all kinds of machinations, and also usage of these rules is something that was very well understood by this man, Niccolò Machiavelli, who worked here in this Palazzo Vecchio from 1498 to 1512. So he very much was the chancellor, if you wish, of the government in this period. There's his office here, there's a statue for him here, and he very much wrote the prince to advise the rulers on how to deal also with something like the 500 people put in place to control him. So the questions we're looking at are of all times. The answers fluctuate over time, and it is, of course, very interesting to study them, as we will do this week. Bye-bye.